My dad sold my inheritance while I was deployed. Then he faced justice in court. Sarah Martinez, 28 years old, thought the worst part about being deployed overseas was missing family dinners and birthdays. She was dead wrong. The worst part was getting a text message from her neighbor saying strangers were moving into her grandmother's house, the house that was supposed to be hers forever. The house her dying grandmother promised would always be her sanctuary. The house her own father had just sold behind her back while she was serving her country 8,000 miles away. But here's the thing about betraying a combat veteran. We don't just get mad, we get tactical. And when Sarah discovered her father hadn't just stolen her inheritance, but had been running a years-long con that destroyed multiple lives, she realized this wasn't just about getting her house back. This was about bringing down a predator who thought his own daughter would never fight back. He thought wrong. Have you ever trusted the wrong person? Tell me in the comments. Before we continue, please subscribe. The satellite internet at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan was spotty on the best days. But when Sarah Martinez finally got her emails to load that Tuesday morning in March, she wished the connection had stayed down forever. Sandwiched between spam about car warranties and a forward from her aunt about inspirational quotes was a message from Mrs. Rodriguez, her grandmother's elderly neighbor back in San Antonio. The subject line made her stomach drop. Mija, I'm so sorry about your abuela's house. Sarah read the email 3 times before the words actually registered in her brain. Strangers with a moving truck. Her father directing them. Her grandmother's antique rocking chair being loaded into the back like common furniture instead of the precious heirloom it was supposed to be. Mrs. Rodriguez had assumed Sarah knew about the sale and was just checking to see if she needed anything from the old house before the new owners took possession. The metal chair in the communication tent suddenly felt ice cold against Sarah's back despite the 90-degree Afghan heat. Her grandmother had been dead for exactly 4 months and 2 weeks. The will reading had happened over video call while Sarah was on patrol duty, but the message had been crystal clear. The house on Maple Street, along with everything in it, belonged to Sarah Elizabeth Martinez. Her father had power of attorney to handle the estate paperwork, but only as a formality. The house was supposed to wait for her return. Sarah's hands shook as she tried calling her father's cell phone, straight to voicemail. She tried the house phone, disconnected. Finally, she managed to reach him at his work number at the auto parts store where he'd been employed on and off for the past 15 years, depending on his gambling luck and mood. Sarah, honey, how's my soldier girl? His voice had that fake, cheerful tone he used when he was about to deliver bad news or ask for money, sometimes both. Dad, what happened to Grandma's house? She kept her voice level, professional, the same tone she used when calling in coordinates for supply drops. The pause stretched so long she thought the call had dropped. Then came the sighs and the excuses, tumbling out in the familiar pattern she'd heard her entire childhood. The house needed too much work. The property taxes were killing him. There were debts, so many debts from her grandmother's final medical bills that weren't covered by Medicare. He'd had no choice but to sell quickly to a cash buyer. The market was terrible anyway. Really, he'd done her a favor by handling the messy business while she was deployed. How much? Sarah interrupted his rambling justification. What? How much did you sell it for? Another pause. $180. It needed a new roof, and the foundation had some settling issues. Sarah closed her eyes. Her grandmother's house sat on a corner lot in a gentrifying neighborhood. Even with repairs needed, it should have been worth at least $400,000. Her throat felt like she'd been swallowing sand from the Afghan desert. Who bought it? A friend of mine, Marcus Delgado. You remember Marcus from the poker games? He's good people, Sarah. He's planning to fix it up nice. She remembered Marcus, loud laugh, gold chains, always bragging about his construction business and his weekend trips to the casino boats. The kind of friend her father collected, men who enabled each other's worst impulses and called it brotherhood. I have to go, Dad. My unit's being called up. It was a lie, but she needed to get off the phone before she said something that would make the situation even worse. Sarah, I know you're upset, but you'll understand when you get home. I did what I had to do for the family. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at a dusty computer screen in a tent 8,000 miles from the only place that had ever truly felt like home. That night, Sarah lay on her narrow bunk staring at the canvas ceiling while her bunkmate's snoring competed with the distant hum of generators. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her grandmother's house, not as the crime scene it had become, but as the sanctuary it had been during the worst years of her childhood. She'd been 8 years old when her parents' marriage finally exploded in a spectacular mess of accusations, thrown dishes, and lawyers who charged by the hour. While her father gambled away their savings and her mother worked double shifts to keep the lights on, Sarah had found refuge 3 blocks away in her grandmother's small but immaculate home. The house smelled like cinnamon candles and the menthol cigarettes her grandmother snuck when she thought no one was looking. More importantly, it felt safe. "This house has been in our family for 42 years, her grandmother had told her one afternoon while they folded laundry together on the kitchen table. Sarah was 12 then, still reeling from her parents' divorce and her father's weekend visitations that usually involved him parking her at his friend's house while he played poker. "Your grandfather bought it with his first paycheck from the railroad, and we raised your daddy right here in that back bedroom. Someday, mija, this will all be yours." Her grandmother had meant it as comfort, but to Sarah it had sounded like a promise. A guarantee that no matter how chaotic her family became, she would always have that yellow house with the creaky front porch and the pecan tree in the backyard. Through high school heartbreaks and college stress, through her decision to enlist and the brutal months of basic training, the house had been her anchor point. Her grandmother would call every Sunday, sharing neighborhood gossip and reminding Sarah that her room was exactly as she'd left it, waiting for her return. The conversations had become shorter during her grandmother's final year. The woman who once remembered every detail of Sarah's life began forgetting names and dates. She'd call Sarah by her mother's name sometimes, or ask when her husband was coming home from work, forgetting he'd been dead for 15 years. But even in those confused moments, she never forgot the house, never forgot her promise. "The papers are all ready," she'd whispered during Sarah's last visit home before deployment. Her grandmother had been tiny by then, lost in a hospital bed that seemed to swallow her whole. "Everything's written down proper. Your daddy knows what to do. The house will be yours, mija, just like I always said." Sarah had kissed her forehead and promised to make the house beautiful again when she got back from Afghanistan. Fresh paint, new curtains for the kitchen windows, maybe finally fix that loose board on the front steps. Her grandmother had smiled and squeezed her hand with surprising strength. 3 weeks later, Sarah was conducting a vehicle inspection outside Kandahar when Sergeant Martinez found her to deliver the news. Heart attack in her sleep. Peaceful, they said. The funeral was held over video call because Sarah's leave request had been denied due to a security situation in their sector. Now lying in her bunk with sand still gritty between her teeth from the day's patrol, Sarah felt something harden in her chest. Her father had broken more than just a legal trust. He'd shattered a promise made by a dying woman to her granddaughter. He'd stolen not just property, but 40 years of family history and the last gift of a woman who'd loved Sarah unconditionally. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. If her father thought being thousands of miles away made her helpless, he was about to learn exactly what kind of tactical planning they taught soldiers. This wasn't over, it was just beginning. The next morning, Sarah requested permission to use the satellite phone for a family emergency. Staff Sergeant Kim gave her 15 minutes and privacy in the command tent, probably assuming someone else had died. In a way, Sarah thought grimly, someone had. Her faith in her father had just flatlined. Her first call was to the Bazar County Clerk's office. After being transferred 3 times, she finally reached someone who could access property records. Yes, the house at 2247 Maple Street had been sold on December 15th. No, they couldn't provide details over the phone to someone who wasn't the owner of record. Sarah hung up and immediately called her grandmother's lawyer, Mr. Gonzalez, who had handled the will. "Sarah, mija, I was wondering when you'd call." His voice carried the weight of someone delivering bad news to grieving families for 30 years. "I tried to reach you through the military channels, but they said you were in a communications blackout." "Mr. Gonzalez, my dad said he had to sell the house for medical debts. Is that true?" The lawyer's sigh was audible even through the crackling satellite connection. "Your father came to my office in November with a folder full of bills, said your grandmother had been hiding her financial problems and the estate couldn't cover the debts. He had documentation showing medical bills, property tax liens, even some credit card debt I'd never seen before." Sarah's stomach clenched. But you wrote the will. You knew what assets she had. That's just it, Sarah. Your grandmother's finances were always simple. Medicare covered most of her medical care, and she owned that house free and clear. She lived modestly but comfortably on Social Security and your grandfather's railroad pension. These debts your father showed me, they didn't make sense with what I knew about her situation. So why didn't you stop the sale? I asked questions, lots of them. But your father had all the paperwork, and more importantly, he had legal power of attorney. The will gave him authority to settle the estate's debts before distribution. If there really were legitimate debts exceeding the estate's assets, the house would have to be sold. Mr. Gonzalez paused. I told him he should wait until you returned from deployment to discuss it with you, but he said the creditors were threatening foreclosure. Sarah closed her eyes, seeing the pattern her father had used her entire life. Create a crisis, demand immediate action, make everyone else feel guilty for questioning his decisions. Mr. Gonzalez, I need you to get me copies of everything. The will, the power of attorney documents, and especially those debt records my father showed you. Sarah, I can't just hand over estate documents to... I'm the primary beneficiary of that estate. That house was supposed to be mine. If my father committed fraud, I need to know. Her voice had taken on the command tone she used with new recruits. And I need you to find out who actually owns that house now. There was a long pause. I'll see what I can do. But Sarah, proving fraud from Afghanistan is going to be nearly impossible. Your father covered his tracks well. After ending the call, Sarah sat in the suffocating heat of the tent, her mind racing. Her father had been planning this for months, possibly since her grandmother's death. He'd used Sarah's deployment as cover, knowing she couldn't question his decisions or examine the documents in person. The man who had taught her to ride a bike and helped with her math homework had calculated exactly how to rob her blind while she served her country. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother Danny. Dad says you're upset about the house. Come on, Sarah. Grandma's gone. It's just a building. Why are you trying to cause family drama when we're all still grieving? Sarah stared at the message, realizing her father had already begun controlling the narrative, painting her as the unreasonable one for wanting to keep a promise made by a dying woman. The manipulation was masterful and heartbreakingly familiar. Sarah spent the next week using every free moment to dig deeper into the timeline of events. Her training as a military intelligence specialist had taught her that the devil lived in the details, and her father's story was starting to show cracks under scrutiny. She'd managed to get phone access to Mrs. Rodriguez, her grandmother's neighbor, who turned out to be a goldmine of information. The elderly woman had kept meticulous mental notes of everything happening on Maple Street, probably because she had nothing else to occupy her retirement days. Your abuela was doing fine financially, mija, Mrs. Rodriguez said during their crackling phone conversation. She even hired that nice boy from down the street to paint her fence last summer. Paid him cash too, $200 for 2 days' work. She wouldn't have done that if she was worried about money. More importantly, Mrs. Rodriguez had witnessed several strange visits to the house during November and December. Your papa was there almost every day after the funeral, going through her things. But he wasn't alone. That friend of his, the one with the fancy truck and the gold chains, he came by 3 or 4 times, walking through the rooms like he was measuring for furniture. Marcus Delgado, the poker buddy who had conveniently become the buyer. Sarah made notes on her phone, building a timeline that stank of premeditation. The real breakthrough came when Sarah managed to contact her grandmother's bank. After being transferred through 6 different departments and providing enough personal information to qualify for a security clearance, she finally reached someone willing to discuss the account activity. Her grandmother had been listed as a reference on Sarah's military banking documents, which apparently gave her some limited rights to information. The bank representative's findings made Sarah's blood run cold. Her grandmother's checking account had shown regular small withdrawals throughout the final 6 months of her life. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alerts, but consistent enough to drain her savings systematically. The withdrawals were made using her ATM card, but always at the same location, a casino about 20 miles from her grandmother's house. Sarah knew her grandmother hadn't gambled a day in her life. The woman had considered playing bingo at church too risky. But the ATM withdrawals coincided perfectly with her father's poker nights, which had supposedly moved locations during that time period. He'd been using his mother's ATM card to fund his gambling, slowly bleeding her accounts dry while she struggled with increasing dementia. The pattern became clearer when Sarah cross-referenced the dates with her grandmother's medical appointments. The withdrawals always happened on days when her grandmother had doctor visits or was staying overnight at the hospital for tests. Days when her father would have been responsible for her care and would have had access to her purse and wallet. Sarah's hands shook as she added up the stolen amounts, nearly $30,000 over 6 months. Money that should have been part of the estate, money that could have prevented any need to sell the house even if there had been legitimate debts. Her father hadn't just stolen her inheritance. He'd been systematically robbing his own mother during the final months of her life, taking advantage of her deteriorating mental state to fund his gambling addiction. Then he'd manufactured fake debts to justify selling the house to his accomplice, probably planning to split the profits later. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. This wasn't a desperate man making a hard choice during a family crisis. This was a calculated predator who had spent months planning how to rob his own family, while his daughter risked her life in a combat zone. Sarah closed her notes app and stared out at the Afghan mountains in the distance. Her father had made a fatal error in his calculations. He'd assumed she would come home defeated, too overwhelmed by grief and military exhaustion to fight back. He'd forgotten that the same military that kept her away from home had also taught her exactly how to plan and execute a mission. And taking down a family thief was about to become her most important operation. 8 months later, Sarah's boots hit Texas soil with a mixture of relief and barely contained rage. The homecoming ceremony at Fort Sam Houston was everything military families dreamed of. Flags waving, tears flowing, and loved ones rushing forward with welcome home signs. Sarah scanned the crowd for her father's face, part of her hoping he'd at least have the decency to show up. He wasn't there. Neither were her siblings. The only familiar face in the crowd belonged to her best friend from high school, Maria, who'd driven down from Austin with a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, warrior princess." They hugged for a long time while Sarah tried not to let the disappointment show on her face. "Your dad's been telling everyone you're angry about some family business," Maria said as they walked to her car. "Danny and Lisa think you're being dramatic. They don't understand why you won't just let it go and move on." Sarah had spent months preparing for this conversation, but hearing it still felt like a punch to the gut. Her father had used her absence to rewrite the story, painting her as the villain in a tragedy of his own making. "Did they tell you what the family business was?" "Something about your grandmother's house needing to be sold for medical bills. They said you're upset because you wanted to inherit it." Maria's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying not to take sides in a family dispute. Sarah spent the drive to Maria's apartment explaining everything she'd discovered from Afghanistan. The systematic theft from her grandmother's accounts, the manufactured debts, the suspicious sale to her father's poker buddy for half the market value. Maria's expression shifted from skepticism to horror as the scope of the betrayal became clear. The next morning, Sarah drove to her father's apartment complex in a part of town that definitely didn't match his recent spending habits. She found him in the parking lot washing a brand new Cadillac Escalade with temporary plates still in the window. He looked older than she remembered, softer around the middle, but his smile was the same manipulative charm he'd used her entire childhood. "Sarah, there's my soldier girl." He dropped the hose and moved toward her with arms outstretched, but something in her posture made him stop short. "You look good, honey. Military life agrees with you." "Nice truck, Dad. Business must be good at the auto parts store." She kept her voice level, professional, the same tone she'd used when interrogating suspected insurgents. His laugh sounded forced. "Oh, this old thing. I got a great deal from Marcus. He's been helping me out while you were gone, making sure I didn't get too lonely." He gestured toward the apartment complex. "Actually been thinking about upgrading to a house soon, maybe something with a pool." Sarah looked around at the luxury vehicles in the parking lot, the manicured landscaping, the rent prices posted on the leasing office window that were easily 3 times what her father had ever made legitimately. "Dad, we need to talk about Grandma's house." The mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Sarah, I know you're upset, but I did what I had to do. Your grandmother had debts you don't know about. Medical bills, credit cards, property taxes. The house needed thousands in repairs. I saved you from inheriting a financial nightmare. Show me the paperwork. What? The debts, the repair estimates, the medical bills. I want to see everything. Sarah crossed her arms and waited. Her father's jaw tightened. I don't have to prove anything to you. I was her son, and I had legal authority to make those decisions. If you can't accept that and move on, maybe you need to think about what kind of daughter questions her father's judgment after everything he's sacrificed for this family. 3 days after the confrontation with her father, Sarah sat in the austere office of Rebecca Chen, the attorney Maria had recommended. Chen specialized in elder abuse cases and had agreed to a consultation after hearing the basic facts. The lawyer's expression grew progressively grimmer as Sarah laid out her evidence. Your father made several critical mistakes, Chen said, spreading documents across her desk like a poker dealer revealing a losing hand. First, he underestimated how thoroughly the military trains people to document everything. Second, he forgot that bank records don't lie, even when people do. Sarah had spent her first week home gathering evidence with the methodical precision her drill sergeants had beaten into her. Bank statements, medical records, property assessments, even the original contractor estimates her grandmother had gotten for minor repairs 2 years earlier. The picture that emerged was damning. Chen pointed to a stack of medical bills her father had presented to the lawyer as justification for selling the house. These bills are real, but look at the dates. Most of them were submitted to Medicare and fully covered. The ones that weren't covered were co-payments totaling less than $3,000 over 2 years, hardly enough to justify selling a $400,000 house. The property tax liens were equally fraudulent. Sarah's grandmother had been current on her taxes, paid automatically from her checking account every year for the past decade. The liens her father had produced were for a different property entirely, one that belonged to another Martinez family across town. The credit card debt is the most interesting, Chen continued, pulling up documents on her laptop. Your father claimed your grandmother had run up $40,000 in credit card bills during her final year, but the cards were all opened after her dementia diagnosis, using addresses she'd never lived at. The charges were primarily at casinos, high-end electronic stores, and cash advances. Sarah felt sick. Her father had not only stolen from his mother's existing accounts, but had opened new credit lines in her name to fund his spending. The woman who had raised 3 children on a railroad pension and never owned anything more extravagant than a color television had supposedly gone on a shopping spree that would have impressed a lottery winner. Chen's forensic accountant had also uncovered the most damning evidence of all. The sale to Marcus Delgado was structured to avoid scrutiny, but it left a paper trail. Delgado paid $180,000 for the house, but immediately took out a $350,000 equity line of credit against it. Guess who's listed as a co-borrower on that loan? Sarah didn't need to guess. Her father's signature was right there on the loan documents, along with an address she didn't recognize. Chen's investigator had already confirmed that the address belonged to a rental house in one of San Antonio's most expensive neighborhoods. Property records showed her father had signed a year-long lease the same week the house sale closed. They were planning to flip the property for profit, Chen explained. Delgado gets the loan money to renovate. Your father gets a cut of the profits when they sell it for market value. Meanwhile, they've both committed multiple felonies, including elder abuse, fraud, and identity theft. Sarah stared at the documents, feeling a mixture of vindication and devastation. She'd hoped, despite everything, that her father had acted out of desperation rather than pure greed. The evidence showed otherwise. This wasn't a man overwhelmed by circumstances. This was a predator who had systematically exploited his mother's vulnerability to fund a lifestyle he'd never earned. What are my options? She asked. Chen smiled for the first time since the consultation began. We're going to court, and we're going to destroy them. But first, I want you to understand something. This isn't just about getting your house back. Your father committed serious crimes against a vulnerable elderly person. We're not just filing a civil lawsuit. We're talking about criminal charges that could put him in prison for years. Sarah hadn't expected Marcus Delgado to be easy to find, but the man had apparently grown careless with success. A quick search of public records showed him living in her grandmother's house, running his construction business from the converted garage and posting photos of his weekend casino trips all over social media. For someone involved in a fraud scheme, he had remarkably poor operational security. Chen's private investigator had suggested a direct approach. Sometimes, she explained, co-conspirators got nervous when they realized their partner might throw them under the bus to save himself. Sarah agreed to make the contact, but insisted on recording everything. Her military training had taught her that intelligence gathering was often about making people comfortable enough to hang themselves with their own words. She found Marcus on a Tuesday morning replacing the front steps of what should have been her house. He was bigger than she remembered from her father's poker games, soft around the middle with arms that suggested he'd done actual construction work at some point in his life. He looked up when she approached, and she watched recognition dawn across his face. "Sarah Martinez, you're looking good, girl. Military life treating you right?" His smile was cautious but genuine, the expression of a man who wasn't sure if he was in trouble yet. "Hello, Marcus. Nice house." She gestured to the fresh paint job and new landscaping he'd added. "You've done a lot of work on it." Marcus straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "Yeah, well, your dad told me it needed some fixing up. I got a good deal because I was willing to put in the sweat equity, you know?" Sarah nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Dad said you guys worked something out that helped everybody. I appreciate you taking care of the family business while I was deployed." Something in Marcus's posture relaxed. Sarah recognized the body language from her interrogation training. He wanted to talk, wanted to justify his actions to someone who might understand. "Your dad was in a real bind with all those medical bills and everything," Marcus said, settling onto the porch steps he'd been replacing. "He didn't want to burden you while you were over there fighting for the country, you know? Man's got to handle his business." "Must have been a lot of bills to justify selling for so much under market value," Sarah said carefully. Marcus looked uncomfortable. "Yeah, well, that's the thing. The house needed work, and the market was soft, and your dad needed cash fast. Sometimes you got to take what you can get." He paused, studying her face. "But I've been thinking maybe I didn't get as good a deal as I thought I did." Sarah raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The silence stretched until Marcus felt compelled to fill it. "See, the thing is, I did some checking after I bought the place. Property values in this neighborhood, they've been going up, not down. And some of those repair estimates your dad showed me, they seemed kind of high when I actually got contractors out here." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm starting to think maybe your dad wasn't completely straight with me about the situation." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. "What kind of situation?" "Well, he told me your grandmother was deep in debt, had been hiding financial problems from the family. Said the estate was upside down and he needed to sell fast before creditors started foreclosure proceedings. Made it sound like he was doing everyone a favor by finding a cash buyer willing to take it off his hands quickly." Marcus stood up and paced to the edge of the porch. "But I've been living here 4 months now, and I haven't seen any creditors. No collection letters, no liens, nothing. Starting to feel like maybe I got played just as much as anybody else." 2 weeks after her conversation with Marcus, Sarah sat in Rebecca Chen's conference room, surrounded by boxes of evidence that looked like the aftermath of a paper explosion. Bank records, medical files, property assessments, and court documents covered every surface. Chen's team had been working around the clock to build what she called an airtight case that even a lazy prosecutor couldn't screw up. The breakthrough had come when Marcus agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for immunity from prosecution. His conscience had been eating at him since Sarah's visit, especially after his own contractor friends confirmed that the house had needed maybe $5,000 in repairs, not the $50,000 her father had claimed. Marcus had turned over recordings of phone conversations with her father, bank records showing the equity loan scheme, and most damning of all, text messages discussing how to keep Sarah in the dark until the paperwork was final. "Your father made one critical error," Chen explained, pointing to a timeline she'd created on the whiteboard. "He got greedy. If he'd just stolen the ATM money and left it at that, we might never have caught him, but selling the house created a paper trail that exposed everything. The district attorney's office had already filed criminal charges: elder abuse, identity theft, fraud, conspiracy, and theft over $100,000, which made it a first-degree felony in Texas. Sarah's father was looking at potentially decades in prison if convicted on all counts, but criminal charges were just the beginning. Chen's civil case sought to recover not just the house but damages for emotional distress, punitive damages for the systematic nature of the fraud, and attorney's fees. They were also pursuing a separate case against the credit card companies that had issued cards to a woman with documented dementia without proper verification. The total amount they were seeking would wipe out everything her father had ever owned and probably garnish his wages for the rest of his life. "The beauty of this case," Chen said with obvious satisfaction, "is that your father documented his own crimes. Every fake bill he created, every forged document he filed, every lie he told the probate court is preserved in writing. He thought he was being thorough. Actually, he was building our case for us." Sarah stared at a photograph of her grandmother's house that had been taken for the property assessment. In the picture, the yellow paint was faded but intact. The pecan tree in the backyard was heavy with nuts, and her grandmother's rocking chair was visible through the front window. It looked exactly as she remembered it, exactly as it was supposed to stay. "What if he tries to claim he was protecting the family?" Sarah asked. "That he made these decisions because he thought they were best?" Chen smiled grimly. "That defense might work if he'd consulted with you, if he'd been transparent about the debts, if he'd gotten fair market value for the house. But the ATM thefts started while your grandmother was still alive and mentally competent. The fake credit cards were opened using false addresses. The sale was structured to hide the true buyers and the real transaction amounts. This isn't a man who made bad decisions under pressure. This is a man who spent months planning how to rob his own family." The conference room door opened, and Chen's investigator walked in with a folder that made Sarah's lawyer's eyes light up. "We found something interesting," the investigator said, spreading new documents across the table. "Your father's been doing this before." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "We ran background checks on all his known associates, cross-referenced property records, looked for similar patterns. Your father was involved in at least 2 other questionable property transactions over the past 5 years. Both involved elderly property owners who died shortly after signing over power of attorney. Both properties were sold to the same buyer's network for below market value." Chen studied the documents with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "Sarah, your father isn't just a family thief. He's a serial predator who targets vulnerable elderly people. Your grandmother wasn't his first victim. She was just his most convenient one." The text message from her sister Lisa arrived at 2:17 a.m., waking Sarah from the first decent sleep she'd gotten in weeks. "Dad's in jail. Are you happy now? You've destroyed our family over a stupid house. Mom's crying, Danny won't talk to anyone, and I hope you're satisfied." Sarah stared at the message in the darkness of her apartment, feeling a mixture of vindication and unexpected grief. The arrest had happened that afternoon. Chen had warned her it was coming, but Sarah hadn't anticipated how it would feel to watch her father led away in handcuffs on the evening news. The reporter had described him as a local man accused of defrauding elderly victims, including his own mother, and Sarah had turned off the television before they could show his mugshot. Her phone rang almost immediately after Lisa's text. It was Danny, her younger brother, and his voice was thick with anger and what sounded like alcohol. "I hope you're proud of yourself, Sarah. Dad's sitting in county lockup because his daughter decided to be vindictive about some old house nobody even wanted. Danny, he stole from Grandma while she was dying. He opened credit cards in her name. He took her ATM card to casinos. He forged documents." "That's what your fancy lawyer says. Dad says it's all lies, that you're twisting everything because you're bitter about missing the funeral." Danny's voice cracked. "He raised us, Sarah. He wasn't perfect, but he was there when Mom checked out emotionally. And now you've got him facing decades in prison over what? Money? Property?" Sarah closed her eyes, recognizing the same manipulation tactics her father had used on her throughout childhood. Create a crisis, blame someone else, make the victims feel guilty for their own victimization. Danny, I have bank records, I have recordings, I have his own handwriting on forged documents. This isn't about being bitter. This is about the fact that our father is a criminal who preys on elderly people. Our father is a 62-year-old man with diabetes and high blood pressure who's going to die in prison because his daughter couldn't forgive him for making hard decisions during a family crisis. Danny hung up, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in the pre-dawn darkness. The real blow came 3 days later when Sarah's mother called. They hadn't spoken since before Sarah's deployment, their relationship another casualty of her parents' toxic divorce 15 years earlier. Her mother's voice was smaller than Sarah remembered, worn down by decades of disappointment and broken promises. Sarah, I know your father and I had our problems, but he's still the father of my children. Lisa says you could drop the charges if you wanted to, that this whole thing could go away if you just accept the money from selling the house and move on. Her mother's voice was pleading. Desperate. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to think about your brother and sister. They don't understand why their big sister wants to put their daddy in prison. Sarah found herself crying for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Mom, he didn't just steal from me. He stole from Grandma while she was sick and scared and didn't understand what was happening. He used her dementia against her. He opened credit cards in her name and ran up bills she'll never be able to pay because she's dead. But she is dead, Sarah. She's gone. Destroying your father won't bring her back, and it won't undo what happened. Sometimes you have to choose between being right and keeping your family together. After her mother hung up, Sarah sat on her couch surrounded by legal documents and evidence of her father's crimes, feeling more alone than she ever had in Afghanistan. Her family saw her as the villain in this story, the ungrateful daughter who'd chosen money over family loyalty. They couldn't or wouldn't see that she was fighting for something bigger than inheritance. She was fighting for justice for a woman who'd loved them all unconditionally and deserved better than to be robbed blind by her own son in her final months. The Bayard County Courthouse buzzed with pre-trial energy as Sarah walked through the metal detectors on a Monday morning in October. 6 months had passed since her father's arrest, and the media attention had transformed what should have been a family matter into a public spectacle. Local news crews had latched onto the story of the deployed soldier whose father had stolen her inheritance, turning it into a cautionary tale about elder abuse and family greed. Sarah's father sat at the defense table looking older and more frail than she remembered. His expensive lawyer, Gerald Hoffman, was a well-known criminal defense attorney who specialized in white-collar cases and had somehow managed to get her father out on bond despite the flight risk assessment. Sarah wondered where the money for Hoffman's retainer had come from, then realized it was probably from the same source as everything else her father had bought in the past year. Jury selection had taken 3 days. Hoffman had tried to eliminate anyone with military connections, anyone who'd cared for elderly parents, and anyone who'd experienced financial fraud. The prosecutor, Assistant DA Maria Santos, had focused on finding jurors who understood the difference between making hard choices and committing premeditated crimes. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 25 to 67. Hoffman's opening statement was a masterclass in manipulation. He painted Sarah's father as a devoted son overwhelmed by his mother's medical crisis while his daughter was deployed overseas. Ladies and gentlemen, Roberto Martinez is not a criminal. He's a man who made difficult decisions during impossible circumstances. His mother was dying, the medical bills were mounting, and he had power of attorney to handle her affairs. Yes, he sold the house. Yes, he used some of the money for his own expenses, but everything he did was legal under Texas law, and everything he did was done with the best intentions for his family. Hoffman acknowledged the ATM withdrawals, but characterized them as Roberto helping his mother access her own money when she was too weak to go to the bank herself. He dismissed the credit card fraud as a misunderstanding about which cards belonged to whom. Most importantly, he portrayed Sarah as a bitter daughter who'd been overseas while her father dealt with the messy realities of elder care, only to return home and attack him for making pragmatic decisions. The prosecution wants you to believe that Roberto Martinez is some kind of criminal mastermind who spent months planning to defraud his own mother, Hoffman said, gesturing toward the evidence boxes. But what you'll actually see is a man who is trying to keep his family afloat during the worst crisis of his life, only to have his own daughter drag him into criminal court because she didn't get the inheritance she felt entitled to. Santos's opening statement was precise and devastating. She walked the jury through the timeline of Roberto's crimes, from the first unauthorized ATM withdrawal to the final fraudulent property sale. She explained how he'd systematically exploited his mother's dementia, created fake debts to justify selling her house, and conspired with Marcus Delgado to hide the true nature of the transaction. This case isn't about hard choices during family emergencies, Santos told the jury. This is about a man who saw his mother's vulnerability as an opportunity. Roberto Martinez didn't help his mother access her money. He stole it. He didn't sell her house to pay her debts. He sold it to fund his gambling addiction and lavish lifestyle. And he did all of this while his daughter was serving our country in Afghanistan, unable to protect the grandmother who had loved and trusted him. Santos concluded by promising the jury they would hear from Marcus Delgado, see bank records that couldn't lie, and examine documents that revealed the true scope of Roberto's betrayal. By the end of this trial, you'll understand that Roberto Martinez isn't a victim of circumstances. He's a predator who chose to prey on the most vulnerable member of his own family. The trial had been grinding through testimony for 5 days when Rebecca Chen called Sarah with news that would change everything. "We found something at your grandmother's house that Marcus never mentioned. He's been renovating the master bedroom and discovered a hidden safe behind a loose baseboard. Sarah, you need to get down here immediately." Sarah arrived at what should have been her house to find Chen, Marcus, and a locksmith standing around a small fireproof safe that had been built into the wall decades earlier. Marcus looked sheepish as he explained that he'd only found it that morning while replacing rotted baseboards. "I was going to call you anyway," he said. "Finding this just confirms I made the right choice." The locksmith worked for 20 minutes before the safe clicked open. Inside were her grandmother's important papers, some jewelry Sarah remembered from childhood, and a small digital camera that looked out of place among the vintage documents. Chen picked up the camera and turned it on, scrolling through the few videos stored in its memory. "Your grandmother was more aware than anyone realized," Chen said, her voice tight with controlled anger. She handed Sarah the camera. "Watch the one dated November 15th. Sarah pressed play and felt her world shift. Her grandmother sat on the edge of her bed, looking directly into the camera. She appeared frailer than Sarah remembered, but completely lucid, her eyes sharp and focused. "If someone is watching this, it means I was right to be suspicious. My son Roberto has been taking money from my purse and using my bank card. I pretend not to notice because I don't want to believe my own child would steal from me." The video continued for 12 minutes. Sarah's grandmother methodically explained how she'd noticed Roberto going through her purse during his visits, how her bank balance never seemed to match her memory of her spending, and how he'd been pressuring her to sign papers she didn't understand. Most devastating of all, she held up copies of documents Roberto had asked her to sign, explaining that she'd hidden them instead because they looked like they would give him control of her house. "I know my mind isn't what it used to be," her grandmother said toward the end of the recording. "But I'm not stupid. Roberto thinks I don't understand what's happening, but I understand plenty. This house belongs to Sarah. I promised it to her, and I meant it. If Roberto tries to sell it after I'm gone, this recording should prove I never wanted that to happen." The final part of the video was her grandmother looking directly into the camera lens. "Sarah, mija, if you're watching this, it means your father did exactly what I was afraid he would do. Don't let him get away with it. I didn't spend 40 years making this a home just so he could gamble it away. You fight for what's yours, and you fight for what's right." Chen was already on the phone with the prosecutor's office before the video finished playing. This wasn't just evidence anymore. This was the voice of the victim herself, speaking from beyond the grave to identify her own abuser and confirm his intent to defraud her granddaughter. The courtroom was packed the next morning as Prosecutor Santos announced she had new evidence to present. Judge Morrison cleared the jury while attorneys argued about admissibility, but the video was ultimately allowed as a dying declaration and evidence of the victim's mental state during the alleged crimes. When the jury returned and the video began playing, Sarah watched her father's face drain of color. His attorney, Hoffman, frantically scribbled notes while her grandmother's voice filled the courtroom with calm, clear testimony about her son's betrayal. Several jurors were visibly emotional by the time the recording ended, and Sarah noticed one older woman wiping away tears. But Santos wasn't finished. Your Honor, this video led us to investigate further into Mr. Martinez's activities during his mother's final months. What we discovered goes far beyond the charges already filed. She gestured to a new stack of evidence boxes. We now have evidence that Mr. Martinez's crimes against his mother were part of a much larger pattern of elder abuse targeting vulnerable seniors throughout San Antonio. The revelation unfolded like a nightmare. Roberto Martinez hadn't just exploited his own mother's dementia. Working with a network of accomplices, he'd been systematically targeting elderly people with cognitive decline, befriending them at senior centers and church groups, then gradually gaining their trust and access to their finances. Over 3 years, he'd stolen from at least 8 different victims, always using the same methods: small, regular ATM withdrawals, fake emergency expenses, and eventual property transfers to associates who would split the profits. Sarah's grandmother hadn't been his first victim. She'd been his last resort when his other schemes started attracting attention from adult protective services. Using his relationship as her son, he'd moved his operation into her home where he could steal more openly while maintaining the cover of family caregiving. Santos presented evidence showing Roberto had used the same fake medical bills and forged documents with previous victims. He'd convinced an 89-year-old veteran to sign over his house to cover urgent surgery costs that didn't exist. He'd drained a widow's retirement account by claiming her deceased husband had left gambling debts that needed immediate payment. The pattern was identical in every case: create a financial crisis, offer to help solve it, then steal everything while the victim was too confused or trusting to stop him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Santos said, her voice carrying the weight of righteous anger, "Roberto Martinez didn't make desperate decisions during a family emergency. He's a career criminal who spent years perfecting his methods of exploiting the most vulnerable members of our community. His own mother wasn't a casualty of circumstance. She was his final target before his daughter came home and exposed his crimes." Sarah felt physically sick as the scope of her father's betrayal became clear. This wasn't about gambling debts or poor judgment. Her father was a predator who had built his entire lifestyle on the systematic abuse of elderly people who trusted him. Her grandmother hadn't just been robbed by her son. She'd been murdered financially by a man who saw her dementia as nothing more than a business opportunity. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Sarah spent that time in the courthouse cafeteria with Chen and Santos, unable to eat or focus on conversation. When the bailiff finally called them back to the courtroom, Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. Roberto Martinez stood as the jury foreman read the verdict: guilty on all counts: elder abuse, identity theft, fraud, conspiracy, and theft of property valued over $300,000. The conviction on the enhanced charges, combined with evidence of his systematic targeting of vulnerable adults, meant he was facing 30 to 50 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the criminal conviction was only the beginning of Roberto's consequences. The civil case proceeded immediately, and with the criminal verdict as evidence, the jury awarded Sarah not just the return of her grandmother's house, but punitive damages totaling $2.3 million. Every asset Roberto had acquired through his crimes would be seized and liquidated to pay restitution to his victims. Marcus had already signed papers transferring the house back to Sarah for the exact amount he'd originally paid, plus interest. He'd also provided information that led to the recovery of assets from Roberto's other accomplices. The man who'd been afraid he was being played had become instrumental in unraveling the entire criminal network. The most satisfying moment came during the sentencing hearing when Judge Morrison addressed Roberto directly. "Mr. Martinez, you didn't just steal money. You stole the peace of mind, security, and dignity of elderly people who trusted you. You exploited your own mother's illness for profit. You betrayed your daughter while she served our country overseas. This court sentences you to 45 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and I hope you spend every day of that sentence thinking about the lives you destroyed." Sarah used part of her settlement money to establish the Elena Martinez Foundation for Elder Protection, named after her grandmother. The foundation provided legal assistance to families dealing with financial elder abuse and trained social workers to recognize the warning signs of systematic exploitation. Within 2 years, they'd helped recover over $8 million in stolen assets and prevented countless other seniors from becoming victims. The house on Maple Street became Sarah's home again, exactly as her grandmother had promised. She kept the yellow paint and the pecan tree, but added a small garden where her grandmother's ashes were scattered. On quiet evenings, she'd sit in the old rocking chair on the front porch, watching the neighborhood kids play in the street and feeling the presence of the woman who'd fought to protect her inheritance, even from beyond the grave. Roberto Martinez died in prison 18 months into his sentence, alone and unvisited by the family he'd destroyed. Sarah didn't attend the funeral. She was too busy helping other families seek justice for their own stolen inheritances, turning her personal tragedy into a crusade that honored her grandmother's memory by protecting other people's grandmothers from predators like the man who'd once been her father. 5 years later, Sarah stood in the very courtroom where her father had been convicted, but this time she was there as an advocate. The Elena Martinez Foundation had just won their 50th case, helping another military family recover assets stolen by a relative during deployment. As she watched the grateful family embrace outside the courthouse, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her brother Danny. "I saw the news story about your foundation. I was wrong about everything. I'm sorry it took me this long to see who Dad really was. Grandma would be proud of you." Sarah smiled, thinking about the power reversal that had brought her to this moment. Her father had tried to make her the villain for seeking justice, painting her as the ungrateful daughter who'd chosen money over family. But she'd refused to accept his narrative. Instead of being the victim he'd counted on her becoming, she'd become the protector he'd never expected her to be. The man who thought deploying his daughter overseas made her powerless had forgotten one crucial thing. The military doesn't just teach you how to fight, it teaches you how to win. And Sarah Martinez had turned her father's greatest betrayal into her grandmother's most lasting legacy. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's making sure it never happens to anyone else.
We're grateful you stayed with us. For more stories of women reclaiming their voice, click on the left and subscribe to stay connected. May this be a reminder, your story has power, too.